All roads converge. On Julian Assange. In previous episodes we already covered the crucifixion of Julian Assange and the banality of evil, as well as the first two parts of the section on modern-day heretics, looking at heretics on COVID-19 and heretics on the Holocaust. We now move on to heretics on regime change wars. Speaking in 1983 with a very young John Pilger, and having viewed, firsthand, the endgame of the Third Reich's war machine, Martha Gellhorn explained the missed opportunities she saw, post-World War II, and especially post-Vietnam. She spoke of the long-lasting impact she believed this had on the collective West, particularly on the United States. 40 years later, we could apply her words to more recent wars, including the one raging in Ukraine as I write this.
You wrote contemptuously, didn't you, of the Germans? You called them a whole nation passing the buck. And you've never really forgiven the Germans, have you?
Never. Never.
You mentioned buck passing, but surely most nations after a defeat in war do that. You yourself have accused the United States of buck passing since the Vietnam War.
Oh, they've just brushed it under the carpet. What would help America would have been a real commission of inquiry into that war.
And Nuremberg?
And Nuremberg. And it would have been the most useful thing for future military and political attitudes on the part of the US. Instead of which it's pushed under the rug, and the unfortunate GIs, who are the victims of it in America, can go and peddle their peanuts. And as for the Vietnamese, they were promised, apparently, by Nixon, something over $3 billion in reparations. They never got it. And instead they're treated to a policy of oppressive harassment. Imagine being on the side of the Khmer Rouge in the UN. I mean, all this is absolutely shocking.
There's a movement now in the United States to rewrite the history of the Vietnam War and blame it on the Vietnamese, isn't there? To blame the Vietnamese.
Oh, I don't doubt it. And equally, not only to blame the Vietnamese for what? To blame the Vietnamese for not having been beaten. That's really what it amounts to. But the worst of it is the spitefulness and the ugliness of supporting the Khmer Rouge, who were monsters, who killed their own people, who did genocide in Cambodia, simply because it's too painful to suggest that the Vietnamese, in fact, saved the remnants of Cambodia by coming in. You know, this thing about stupidity can become criminal. And this is criminal stupidity, it seems to me. We should admit it was a mistake. It was a terrible mistake. It was a mistake against America, as well as against Vietnam. And then make our policy on the basis of admitting mistakes. But perhaps governments never admit mistakes, and perhaps that's what's wrong with government. People learn from mistakes. Hopefully, they try to learn from mistakes. They try to correct their own lives from mistakes. We all make mistakes, born making mistakes, never stop making mistakes. But if you're not insane, you attempt to learn from them and then alter your behavior. But governments cannot admit or will not admit mistakes, and therefore apparently don't learn and don't change. And that's rough on the rest of us.
Prophetic words. Despite periodic changes of governments, from Democrat to Republican and back again, the US has maintained its course since at least World War II as the world's greatest ever war machine, conducting overt wars and covert regime change operations on all continents, except Antarctica. The only presidency in which no new war has been started was the one-term Trump presidency, but even during that presidency, existing war and regime change operations continued. In the context of the quote insurgency, unquote, that came at the end of Trump's term in office, dissident researcher Whitney Webb had this to say.
The CIA has committed more acts of terrorism, both foreign and domestic, than any domestic extremist could ever hope to. The death toll from the Capitol siege is 6. Want to guess how many people the CIA has had murdered? Operation Condor alone was close to 100,000.
But Operation Condor, which was US collusion in creating the military takeover of many countries in Latin America, was only a small part of what the US has actually achieved, through overt and covert action, in terms of creating mayhem and violent death across our planet. The quote now on the screen came from the video Steve Kangas, 1997, an annotated timeline of CIA atrocities. As an aside, Steve Kangas, quote, committed suicide, unquote, soon after he published his timeline. I am always surprised by the number of people, especially US Americans, who are not aware of the enormous and hideous death count, from what William Bloom called an American Holocaust, at the hands, or at the instigation, of the US CIA. This worldwide corruption and massacre has left its mark across Latin America, Asia, Europe, and Africa. And, many contend, in the US homeland as well, as many US homegrown leaders were assassinated. The sidewalks in my neighborhood are littered with memorial plaques to the up to 30,000 people disappeared by state terrorism during the US-backed military junta. The plaques are cemented in place outside homes and workplaces, since those murdered by these criminals have no graves. For those with the stomach for it, this video is a primer on the US war against the world from World War II to 1990. I'll just play you a minute or two of the introduction.
What follows in this video is from the Kangas summary in his 1997 article. Remember that at least 20 years has passed since he compiled this litany of destruction. According to Kangas, CIA operations follow the same recurring script. First, American business interests abroad are threatened by a popular or democratically elected leader. So, on behalf of American business, and often with their help, the CIA mobilizes the opposition. First, it identifies right-wing groups within the country, usually the military, and offers them a deal. We'll put you in power if you maintain a favorable business climate for us. The agency then hires, trains, and works with them to overthrow the existing government, usually a democracy. It uses every trick in the book: propaganda, stuffed ballot boxes, purchased elections, extortion, blackmail, sexual intrigue, false stories about opponents in the local media, infiltration, and disrupting opposing political parties, kidnapping, beating, torture, intimidation, economic sabotage, death squads, and even assassination. These efforts culminate in a military coup, which installs a right-wing dictator. The CIA trains the dictator's security apparatus to crack down on the traditional enemies of big business, using interrogation, torture, and murder. The victims are said to be communists, but almost always they are just peasants, liberals, moderates, labor union leaders, political opponents, and advocates of free speech and democracy. Widespread human rights abuses follow. This scenario has been repeated so many times that the CIA actually teaches it in a special school, the notorious School of the Americas. It opened in Panama but later moved to Fort Benning, Georgia. Critics have nicknamed it the School of the Dictators and School of the Assassins. Here the CIA trains Latin American military officers how to conduct coups, including the use of interrogation, torture, and murder. The Association for Responsible Dissent estimates that by 1987, 6 million people had died as a result of CIA covert operations. Former State Department official William Blum correctly calls this an American Holocaust. The CIA justifies these actions as part of its war against communism, but most coups do not involve a communist threat. Unlucky nations are targeted for a wide variety of reasons, not only threats to American business interests abroad, but also liberal or even moderate social reforms, political instability, the unwillingness of a leader to carry out Washington's dictates, and declarations of neutrality in the Cold War. Indeed, nothing has infuriated CIA directors quite like our nation's desire to stay out of the Cold War.
The epilogue of this 1997 piece from Steve Kangas, although most people don't get that far, contains an impassioned cry to US citizens to rid the world of the CIA.
In a speech before the CIA, celebrating its 50th anniversary, President Clinton said, "By necessity, the American people will never know the full story of your courage." Clinton's is a common defense of the CIA, namely that the American people should stop criticizing the CIA because they don't know what it really does. This, of course, is the heart of the problem in the first place. An agency that is above criticism is also above moral behavior and reform. Its secrecy and lack of accountability allows its corruption to grow unchecked. Furthermore, Clinton's statement is simply untrue. The history of the agency is growing painfully clear, especially with the declassification of historical CIA documents. We may not know the details of specific operations, but we do know quite well the general behavior of the CIA. These facts began emerging nearly 2 decades ago at an ever-quickening pace. Today we have a remarkably accurate and consistent picture, repeated in country after country, and verified from countless directions. The CIA's response to this growing knowledge and criticism follows a typical historical pattern. Indeed, there are remarkable parallels to the medieval church's fight against the scientific revolution. The first journalists and writers to reveal the CIA's criminal behavior were harassed and censored if they were American writers, and tortured and murdered if they were foreigners. See Philip A.G.'s On the Run for an example of early harassment. However, over the last 2 decades, the tide of evidence has become overwhelming, and the CIA has found that it does not have enough fingers to plug every hole in the dike. This is especially true in the age of the Internet, where information flows freely amongst millions of people. Since censorship is impossible, the agency must now defend itself with apologetics. Clinton's "Americans will never know" defense is a prime example. Another common apologetic is that the world is filled with unsavory characters and we must deal with them if we are to protect American interests at all. There are 2 things wrong with this. First, it ignores the fact that the CIA has regularly spurned alliances with defenders of democracy, free speech, and human rights, preferring the company of military dictators and tyrants. The CIA had moral options available to them, but it did not take them. Second, this argument begs several questions. The first is, which American interests? The CIA has courted right-wing dictators because they allow wealthy Americans to exploit the country's cheap labor and resources. But poor and middle-class Americans pay the price whenever they fight the wars that stem from CIA actions, from Vietnam to the Gulf War to Panama. The second begged question is, why should American interests come at the expense of other people's human rights? The CIA should be abolished, its leadership dismissed, and its relevant members tried for crimes against humanity. Our intelligence community should be rebuilt from the ground up, with the goal of collecting and analyzing information. One thing is clear. Like dictatorship, like monarchy, unaccountable covert operations should die, like the dinosaurs they are.
In the Steve Kangas and William Blum discussion of the role of the US and its CIA, we can hear echoes of Hannah Arendt. The US really do, quote, kill as if their victims were flies. Unquote. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the WikiLeaks collateral murder video, where the murderers were simply a speck in the sky above their victims, and their handlers were not at the site at all. Also in information leaked by the US drone whistleblowers, for which leak Daniel Hale was sentenced to 45 months in prison, on the 27th of July 2021. The Steve Kangas video, reporting on William Blum's findings, with the 6 million dead at US hands, only covered the period up to 1990. The WikiLeaks publications, for which Julian Assange now faces the possibility of a living death in a US supermax prison, are mainly concerned with America's overt and covert actions, including war crimes, in the 21st century. The new century had a Big Bang start with the 11th of September 2001, or 9/11, destruction of New York's Twin Towers, as well as an official version of what happened there, culminating in a report on the 22nd of July 2004. Much has been said and written about that event by dissident researchers. Dissidents fall into mainly three groups. Firstly, those who use the official narrative as a springboard for questions about the poor functioning of US intelligence in not foreseeing, and forestalling, the 9/11 operation. Not least of those in this group are former US intelligence officers and operatives, such as Bill Binney, who was, quote, part of an elite NSA team which designed and built an intelligence gathering system to target and collect data on terrorism threats, unquote, and who has said he believes that the NSA buried key intelligence that could have prevented 9/11. Also, Ray McGovern, a former CIA officer who has long been an outspoken critic of what is coined as the American Military-Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academia think tank, or the MICIMAT, for leading the world ever closer to a nuclear war. Both have since become outspoken supporters of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Secondly, those who question the official story of the mode of destruction, pointing out facts, usually from extensive research, that simply do not fit with the official narrative. These people generally raise well-founded questions, and many call for a new inquiry into the events of 9/11. One example of such a group is the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth Group, who are focused, in particular, on the seemingly controlled demolition of Building 7, a building which was not hit by a plane, but nevertheless fell on that terrible day. There have even been extensive hearings held on this topic, see the 4-day Toronto hearings in 2012. Thirdly, those who disbelieve the whole official explanation, and posit other explanations. During the Holberg debate, December 2017, in Bergen, Norway, entitled Propaganda, Facts and Fake News, Julian Assange was questioned on this topic.
On the 9/11 issue generally, I don't think it is particularly important, in the sense that every day or every few weeks, WikiLeaks and some other publishers publish proof of very serious existing conspiracies that are happening right now or just a couple of years ago in order to start wars or steal billions of dollars. These things, I think, can have more of a change. There's a certain view in relation to 9/11 that it's some kind of holy grail that would shake the existing order of things. I don't think it would, even if it came out that there were some rogue agents involved. And that's how it would be positioned, no matter who it was.
This did not stop Bogdan Jakovich, who worked in the Federal Aviation Administration's Security Division, in the lead-up to the 9/11 attacks, and who belongs in the first group of 9/11 dissenters we just discussed, from saying,
"The federal government goes way out of its way to silence any employee, from the lowest to the highest pay grade, that dares to upset the status quo, and it doesn't make any difference how foul that status is or how many die as a consequence. So I started thinking, what if WikiLeaks had existed prior to the 9/11 attacks?
He follows up that question with a litany of intelligence failures related to 9/11, which he traces through multiple bureaucratic government agencies, and even to the US Congress itself. Whatever really occurred on 9/11, the events of that terrible day were the launching pad for a series of US-led wars. These eventually became documented, via the US-owned records, in the WikiLeaks archives and then in multiple legacy press articles and broadcasts. But before those records were published, starting in 2010, there were voices loudly decrying US warmongering and, in the case of George W. Bush's Second Iraq War, there had been millions marching in the streets all over the world, protesting against the US war plans.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder.
These protesters were unconvinced by the allegations of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, held by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The allegations were later shown to be unfounded, even at the time they were made. It can be helpful at this point to watch Harold Pinter's 2005 Nobel Prize speech, Art, Truth, and Politics, on the role of the US and George W. Bush in the Second Iraq War. This speech was recorded not long before his death.
I have said earlier that the United States is now totally frank about putting its cards on the table. That is the case. Its official declared policy is now defined as full spectrum dominance. That is not my term. It is theirs. Full spectrum dominance means control of land, sea, air and space, and all attendant resources. The United States now occupies 702 military installations throughout the world in 132 countries, with the honorable exception of Sweden, of course. We don't quite know how they got there, but they are there all right. The United States possesses 8,000 active and operational nuclear warheads. 2,000 are on hair-trigger alert, ready to be launched with 15 minutes warning. It is developing new systems of nuclear force known as bunker busters. The British, ever cooperative, are intending to replace their own nuclear missile, Trident. Who, I wonder, are they aiming at? Osama bin Laden? You? Me? Joe Dokes? China? Paris? Who knows? What we do know is that this infantile insanity, the possession and threatened use of nuclear weapons, is at the heart of present American political philosophy. We must remind ourselves that the United States is on a permanent military footing and shows no sign of relaxing it. Many thousands, if not millions of people in the United States itself are demonstrably sickened, shamed, and angered by their government's actions. But as things stand, they are not a coherent political force yet. But the anxiety, uncertainty, and fear which we can see growing daily in the United States is unlikely to diminish. I know that President Bush has many extremely competent speechwriters, but I would like to volunteer for the job myself. I propose the following short address, which he can make on television to the nation. I see him grave, hair carefully combed, serious, winning, sincere, often beguiling, sometimes employing a wry smile, curiously attractive, a man's man. God is good. God is great. God is good. My God is good. Bin Laden's God is bad. His is a bad God. Saddam's God was bad, except he didn't have one. He was a barbarian. We are not barbarians. We don't chop people's heads off. We believe in freedom. So does God. I am not a barbarian. I am the democratically elected leader of a freedom-loving democracy. We are a compassionate society. We give compassionate electrocution and compassionate lethal injection. We are a great nation. I am not a dictator. He is. I am not a barbarian. He is. They all are. I possess moral authority. You see this fist? This is my moral authority. And don't you forget it.
The first Iraq War, or Gulf War, was perpetrated by the senior George Bush, after a fictitious and orchestrated 1990 speech by, then unidentified, daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the US. They tossed the babies out of the incubators and left them to die on the cold floor. One of those loud voices protesting the Second Iraq War was George Galloway, then a UK Member of Parliament, who testified in 2005, before the US Senate committee investigating the UN All-for-Food program, as part of the pre-war sanctions against Iraq. His testimony had begun with his swearing in.
Providing you give us an answer, I'd be delighted to hear it.
Here's my answer, and I hope it does delight you. I opposed the Oil for Food program with all my heart, not for the reasons that you are troubled by it, but because it was a program which saw the death, I'm talking about the death now, I'm talking about a mass grave, of 1 million people, most of them children, in Iraq. The Oil for Food program gave 30 cents per day per Iraqi for the period of the Oil for Food program. 30 cents for all food, all medicine, all clothes, all schools, all hospitals, all public services. I believe that the United Nations had no right to starve Iraq's people because it had fallen out with Iraq's dictator. David Bonnier, your former colleague, Senator, whom I admired very much, a former chief whip here on the Hill, described the sanctions policy as infanticide masquerading as politics. Senator Coleman thinks that's funny, but I think it's the most profound description of that era that I have ever read. Infanticide masquerading as politics. So I opposed this program with all my heart. Not because Saddam was getting kickbacks from it, and I don't know when it's alleged these kickbacks started. Not because some individuals were getting rich doing business with Iraq under it, but because it was a murderous policy of killing huge numbers of Iraqis. That's what troubles me. That's what troubles me.
The unindicted war criminal George H.W. Bush, the senior, is now dead, and so can only face justice in some unearthly realm. But George W. Bush, the son, another unindicted war criminal, has been rehabilitated as an artist, and some type of kindly and funny elder statesman, who shares sweets with Michelle Obama. A recent event, in May 2022, encapsulates this rehabilitation of George W. Bush, and the bloody war he perpetrated in Iraq, for which Julian Assange published the US records, and for which he faces a sentence of living death, in the bowels of the hellish US prison Gulag.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway, 75. Here's
The Gravel Institute, responding to that video, wrote,
If you listen closely, after he corrects himself, he whispers, Iraq too. Here is the former President of the United States, admitting to war crimes, to a laughing crowd. Unfathomably evil.
While George W. Bush, in the US, and Tony Blair, in the UK, have not yet found themselves in the dock in The Hague, they have been found guilty in a war crimes tribunal, one held in Malaysia. Al Jazeera reported, on the 28th of November 2011.
A war crimes tribunal in Malaysia offers a devastating critique of international criminal law institutions today. In Kuala Lumpur, after 2 years of investigation by the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission, a tribunal consisting of 5 judges with judicial and academic backgrounds, reached a unanimous verdict that found George W. Bush and Tony Blair guilty of crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, and genocide, as a result of their roles in the Iraq War. The proceedings took place over a 4-day period, from November the 19th to the 22nd, and included an opportunity for court-appointed defense counsel to offer the tribunal arguments and evidence on behalf of the absent defendants. They had been invited to offer their own defense or send a representative, but declined to do so. The prosecution team was headed by 2 prominent legal personalities with strong professional legal credentials, Gurdeal Singh Nijjar and Francis Boyle. The verdict, issued on the 22nd of November 2011, happens to coincide with the 48th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The tribunal acknowledged that its verdict was not enforceable in a normal manner associated with a criminal court, operating within a sovereign state, or as constituted by international agreement, as is the case with the International Criminal Court. But the KLWCT followed a juridical procedure purported to operate in a legally responsible manner. This would endow its findings and recommendations with a legal weight, expected to extend beyond a moral condemnation of the defendants, but in a manner that is not entirely evident.
Following Afghanistan and Iraq, more wars were waged, or at least supported, by the ever-already United States. These included Hillary Clinton's war in Libya, under Obama, which decimated the richest country in Africa, murdered and sodomized its president, and sent its people back into poverty, and many into slave markets.
So, that is the land of unconfirmed. Yes, we came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit? No, I'm sure it did.
Then Syria, still under Obama. And Yemen. Not to mention many smaller wars in Africa. And we haven't yet gotten to the war of the moment. Ukraine.